Thiel. Book 1. One Foot in Front of the Other. Thiel, by Lynne Pearl. Thiel Clay sat hidden behind a hedgerow, leaning into its undergrowth, sunning himself. It was late autumn, but there were still days of sun thrown away carelessly to any creature to warm himself. Thiel lay with his ugly face turned to the sky. He was short and squat, and nature had tilted one shoulder to the earth, one to the sky. This was how his mind worked, too, sometimes tied to practical reality, and sometimes flying with the clouds. At present it was flying. The hedge was firm and enclosing, and the grassy tussocks rounded and yielding. His legs were spread wide, and his feet inside his work boots fell outwards in relaxation. A money spider ran over his fingers as they lay in the grass. His hand was the embodiment of strength, square, with short fingers, and stained with many seasons' manual work. The fingers were calloused from tools, and a few brown hairs grew on the back of his hand. His clothes were worn at the elbow and knee, and one sleeve was parting company from the jacket at the shoulder, wool threads fluttering in the slight breeze. Thiel loved to be alone, away from questions and conversations, to think his own thoughts quietly to their own conclusion. How often had a daydream, a vision of nature's aimlessness, been cut off in midstream by idle prattle or interfering enquiries? Once halted, the images broke like surf against concrete life. They were so sweet and fine that "Hurry along there, boy," from Foreman Squibb, sent them running for the quiet of his unconscious. He learned all the time from their whisperings, but the lessons were so vague he did not know what he knew, except that he lived with a discomfort that fitted his hunched shoulders as well as his weathered jacket. His dark, lank hair hung in his eyes, hiding a narrow forehead and thick brows. The brows were so ponderous that many people never glimpsed the kind, sensitive looks in the eyes beneath. They felt only repugnance for the crooked face and the cripple's body. He was a marred example of his line. Nature had given Thiel an ugly outer shell and a fine inner core. Large ears appeared from the hair, perpendicular from his head, keeping any hat from sinking onto Thiel's neck. His nose was thick and bulbous, burnt red from daily exposure on hillsides to the sun's glare. His mouth was a thin, straight line, giving away no secrets and showing he trusted few souls. He never talked of himself, and at most all his fellow laborers could get from him was, "It's close, this e'en." When the earth froze beneath their feet, puddles of rainwater turned to ice, and snow began to burst in flurries from the north wind's arms. Thiel's life was divided into an unyielding routine, ruled by the iron hands of season and weather. In spring, Thiel woke to chill, gray dawns and trudged 2 miles to Squire Turo's farm. There he worked in gangs organized each day by Foreman Squibb. They would turn the soil and break the clods. As the winds began to blow warmer, they sowed seeds for wheat, barley, and rye. In early spring, Thiel and the cart horses turned the newly thawed soil. Then, as summer gradually came, the cart horses' lives became easier, and Thiel worked harder. The weeds must be kept in check, the precious sprouts of young crops protected. After that came the long days of harvest and sweat and back-breaking toil. Thiel cut and pitched hay until night fell on the fields and went home still bent. As summer departed and winter arrived quickly, the men wore sacks over their shoulders in the fields to shield themselves from the blasts of icy rain. Wind, rain, sun, and snow were their companions as they pulled a living from the earth. Their bodies were the tools, and their strength the fuel. Most of his days, Thiel was exhausted, so today's rest, hidden behind a hedge, was a solace for his tired body before he walked on to Week Farm. Foreman Squibb that morning had called him. "Walk over to High Week Farm with this letter from the boss." Most of his days, Thiel was exhausted, so today's rest, hidden behind a hedge, was a solace for his tired body before he walked on to Week Farm. Foreman Squibb that morning had called him. "Walk over to High Week Farm with this letter from the boss. It's for the gaffer about some business that's brewing." So Thiel, after resting behind the hedge, had walked the 4 miles over the hills to Week Farm, where it lay nestled in a protective hollow of green hillsides. Farmer Week had been pleased to see Thiel, as Week Farm was a lonely spot, and the opportunity to exchange news was welcome. He was not pleased with the contents of the letter, though, which asked, "A king's ransom for those swine. He thinks them dances jigs." But the arguing that went on over the price of livestock was thoroughly enjoyed by all parties. In fact, if several weeks of offer and counteroffer did not go on, the selling party would feel cheated of his fair bit of game. A bit of barter thrown in for good measure at the end of the bargaining usually sealed a sale. A piece of good woven cloth made by the farmer's wife, or some hanks of spun wool, fresh churned butter, a jug of clotted cream, or a basin of raspberries in season. These were a farmer's seal to close a gentleman's agreement. The sale in question, of the young pigs, was still in its youth, and much thrust and parry would be enjoyed until the pigs were driven down Farmer Week's track to his farm. His trek complete, Thiel sat in the kitchen with Farmer Week, a mug of hot tea on his knee. He rested his boots on the fire fender and roasted his legs by the open fire. The kitchen was crowded with items on every conceivable surface. There were old magazines and newspapers in piles in a corner, seed packets on shelves, mugs on the mantelpiece, old farm implements attached to the wall, a brass bed-warming pan hung over the fireplace, and a tray of new-laid eggs sat on the table. Chairs were taken by coats and cats, and the hearthrug by 2 grateful sheepdogs. Thiel talked of his squire's harvest. It had been only a mediocre output, but the livestock had reproduced proudly this year. There were 10 new goats, 13 pigs, and 19 lambs, and this was not even including the fowl. Old Week had lost half his pig litter to a strange new fever that took the animals before they could mature and grow, and so this bargain had arisen. In my grandfather's time, there was an old healer who lived out Terry Way, said Week, gazing wistfully out of the window. He knew about the animals' sicknesses, talked to them close, and then gave them some powder he'd brewed up from his medicine bottles. Row upon row, in brown glass bottles sat his cures. I saw them once as a lad. He made them from plants he collected all over the county. Up on the high moor, or down by the river Tamar, in a cluster of pines you'd see him, bent over with his trowel, digging and digging for some root. I once seed him picking wild flowers in my south meadow, all dressed in brown, his overcoat reaching to his feet, pockets falling off, and only one button remaining. He was a grim sight, stern and not to be meddled with. He could give you a look to scare your soul into the next world. Seemed he liked hating us creatures, but the animals he were right gentle with. Farmer Week sucked on his pipe, enjoying Thiel's company to reminisce with. He's been dead these 40 years. Just travelled on peaceful like to cure some animals over yonder. Over yonder was folks' dialect for the next life, and it was spoken of with great familiarity and comfort. It was this present world that was their problem. Miss him, though, his wild figure hereabouts, especially when my animals take poorly. I asked him then to give me a bit of advice, but I 'spect he's too busy over yonder with their animals, or else I'm too thick-witted to hear, so the pigs die. He was attached to his pigs, was Week, and his eyes grew moist at the remembrance of their sudden departure, and anger at the loss. Thiel was warm and sleepy, which he was unaccustomed to in the middle of the morning, and moreover he was being conversed with as a man, not a half-wit. He was often ignored or shouted at by his fellow creatures, so he had almost come to think of himself as having no brain. When shouted at, he became overwhelmed with embarrassment, and his mind would only make confused forms. He could only make one word at a time with his lips, and putting a whole sentence together would completely elude him. All that would be left was a mental form that was the answer to the